Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon from the UK and welcome to this ALNAP webinar on how to improve system-wide learning. Thanks to the wonder of Zoom, we have a very big audience today with registrations from around 65 countries around the world. We also have a very stimulating and varied agenda in front of us, and I'll now set the scene with a few reflections. So, not surprisingly, the first reflection is on COVID-19, which of course has been at the forefront of our minds this year. The humanitarian community is now facing massive, almost existential challenges, and it's no exaggeration to say that the very future of the humanitarian system could be at some kind of tipping point. We're now in uncharted territory, and the need to understand exactly what is happening to the system is vital. And to a great extent, this will depend on our capacity to generate evidence and analysis at a system-wide level, rather than just at the level of individual organizations, individual countries, or individual projects. So perhaps the closest comparison to our current predicament is the aftermath of the Rwanda genocide around 1996-1997, when a system-wide evaluation, the Joint Evaluation of Emergency Assistance to Rwanda, or the JEA, posed some fundamental questions about the purpose and relevance of humanitarian action as it was then. And as most of you will know, ALNAP itself was one of the main outcomes from the JEA, and we've played a significant role ever since by supporting system-wide learning from evaluations, both by making evaluations more widely available and by looking at system-wide issues in evaluations, for example, in our State of the Humanitarian System report. So, at this profound moment, the importance of system-wide learning has never been more vital. But for various reasons, it has become more challenging. And let me mention a few of these. So firstly, over the years, the size of the humanitarian system has grown and the volume of evaluative material has increased. There are more and more single agency evaluations, possibly at the expense of system-wide and joint evaluations. And this has meant, although there's more evidence available, it's more dispersed and thus more challenging to locate. And we've also seen some useful innovations in the form of specific evaluation portals and online libraries, including our own help library, and these have been incredibly helpful. But we still don't have a more complete picture of the evaluation landscape itself. And alongside the increase in evaluative material, there's also been a sustained growth in the numbers and size of humanitarian organizations. And of course, that's a good thing, but it also brings with it the need for enhanced collaboration and coordination across the system so that experiences and lessons can be shared and acted upon. Which all goes to say that system-wide learning has never been more important. And in this webinar, we're going to ask how we can access the best available information, how we can raise the quality of the evidence, and how we can improve collaboration and cooperation across the system. We'll also be introducing a new tool, the Eval Mapper, which will provide a picture of the evaluative landscape and will help us enhance more joined up and collaborative thinking. And finally, I'm delighted to tell you that we have a new evaluation and learning team, Susanna and Samir, both of whom you may have already spoken to. So the chair for this webinar is Susanna, who joined us last month. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over to her. Susanna, over to you.
Thank you, John. I'm very pleased to chair this webinar today. It's the first event that I'm hosting in my new role at ALNAP. We have a very exciting panel and a brilliant new ALNAP tool that we are launching. It's great to see the high level of interest in this launch event today. We have over 200 people registered for today's webinar. Now, the question of how to learn from humanitarian evaluations for better sector-wide performance is obviously a recurrent issue. As you just heard from John, this issue is built into the DNA of ALNAP as an organization. Today, we're going to be discussing how evaluations can be better used to support system-wide learning across multiple agencies and responses, including the challenges faced in the pursuit of learning, and what approaches or lessons we can apply moving forward. To get us started today, I need to first briefly mention a few housekeeping rules. First, please use the Q&A function to submit your questions during the event. Please also state your name and affiliation when submitting your questions. My colleagues will be monitoring the Q&A during the event. Second, we want to encourage all of our listeners today to live tweet. You can live tweet using the hashtag #EvalMapper. Briefly now, I want to say just a few words about our plan for the webinar. We have 4 panelists today to promote the launch of our new EvalMapper tool. The plan for this webinar is that our first speaker, James Darcy, will lay out the main challenges around using evaluations for system-wide learning. After our first speaker, we will officially launch the EvalMapper tool with a demo video, followed immediately by interventions from the rest of the panel. Our 4 panelists will talk about their work in the evaluation field and how organizations can turn evaluation evidence into actionable learning. After the panel, we will move directly into the Q&A. This webinar will also highlight the wealth of evaluation material that is currently available in LNAP's help library. There's so much material out there that LNAP decided to create the EvalMapper tool to help users find the evaluations easier. It helps you visually see the evaluation evidence. Today, we're going to look at how LNAP's EvalMapper can help you and others in the humanitarian ecosystem find evaluations faster and in a more user-friendly manner. To get started today, we're going to speak first to James Darcy about some of the key challenges around learning and humanitarian evaluations. But first, just to jumpstart our conversation, I want to invite you all to get some quick feedback from our audience. You're going to see a quick poll pop up before you. If we can please launch our poll now. So if you don't see it, don't panic. I'm told that people who are logging in from web browsers may not be able to use it. But if you could please just take 1 minute to read the question and to reply quickly, then what we'll do is we'll move forward. This is just really to launch the conversation today. So I want to give you all 1 more minute to reply to the poll if you haven't already. And then we're going to ask our team to show us the response. Okay, great. So I think what this shows is that there's probably a lot of issues around why evaluations are not used for learning. Obviously, some of them are maybe that there's a focus on accountability, that there's hard to find existing evaluation evidence. And so all of these topics are going to be touched upon by our first speaker, James Darcy. So I now have the pleasure to introduce James Darcy to you. James Darcy has over 25 years of humanitarian and development experience. He previously worked for Oxfam in Africa, the Balkans, the Middle East, and in South and East Asia. He also worked as director of the Humanitarian Policy Group at ODI. James now practices as an independent consultant. More importantly, James has looked in depth at humanitarian evaluation synthesis work. He conducted the evaluation synthesis for LNAP's 2018 State of the Humanitarian System report. We're now going to go to James Darcy, who will say a few words about some of the challenges to address system-wide learning through evaluation. James, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Susanna, very much. As Susanna mentioned, about 3 years ago, we did a synthesis of humanitarian evaluations to feed into the LNAP State of the Humanitarian System report for 2018. I say synthesis, it was really more of a review, to be honest. We used a sample of around 120 evaluations taken from the LNAP help library. These were evaluations that were published in the previous 3 years. And we were looking for common themes, for patterns of findings that might shed light on how well the humanitarian system was delivering for crisis-affected people around the world. It was quite a diverse sample, I have to say. And we tried to get a reasonable balance of crisis types, of geographical locations, and also of organizational types. So beyond the substantive findings of the synthesis, which fed into the State of the System report, we found three particular issues concerning the evaluations themselves. The first was the very inconsistent quality of the evaluations across the sample, in terms of providing evidence that seemed to us to be reliable. The second was that there was very variable coverage of the DAC criteria. So some criteria were almost universally covered, relevance, appropriateness, effectiveness, and so on. But others, like coordination, connectedness, were much less often covered. Very few evaluations considered the international humanitarian response beyond the single agency or program level. And as a result, the evaluation sample really didn't tell us very much about how well the system was working as a system, or indeed about how well different crisis interventions have worked together. The third issue was this, it was related. It was about a lack of intercomparability, essentially, between different evaluations, individual evaluations, which meant that there was very limited scope to do meta-analysis. So for the purposes of our discussion today, I wanted just to say a little bit more about evaluation quality, about the kinds of evidence that evaluations can be expected to produce. And then I'll relate that to this question of the role of evaluations in enabling lesson learning on issues of system-wide concern. So on evaluation quality and the kinds of evidence that evaluations can produce, well, I won't say much more about quality, except to say that it's closely related to the question of evidence, I think. So our definition of quality for the purposes of the state of the system exercise revolved around evidential weight and depth, if you like, how much evidence there was underlying an evaluation, and also on analytical rigor, whether the findings appeared to follow from, the conclusions followed from evidenced findings. And in that sense, quality was certainly variable across the sample. We found that variation related partly to how well resourced the evaluation function itself was within a given organization, how deep evaluations were able to go, and so on. And of course, it also depended whether the evaluators had actually done a decent job. But the overall point here, I think, is that the lack of rigor and the lack of weight of evidence reduces the evidential value of evaluation findings. I'd make one caveat to that, I think. We can't really separate the question of evaluation quality from the question of evaluation utility. So an evaluation may produce evidence that is good enough for internal use, even if it lacks more general evidential value. And in any case, evaluations may not be the best vehicle for generating more, if you like, scientifically robust evidence. And we shouldn't overload them with expectations in that respect. In the sample we looked at, by the way, there was a particular weakness we felt in relation to evidence about effectiveness, which is surprising because it's in some ways the core evaluation question. We may need to look to research studies and other analytical approaches for more robust evidence, as well as making stronger links to the monitoring function, but that's perhaps a discussion for another day. Which takes me to the second thing I wanted to talk about. What does the relatively narrow and relatively organization-specific focus of the majority of evaluations mean for efforts to use evaluations to shed light on issues of more system-wide concern? And I think there are two agendas here, which we need to distinguish. One is specifically about evaluating collective performance and system-related issues for the purposes of collective accountability and for system learning. But the second is more general. It's about what we can learn from looking across multiple evaluations of separate interventions that is of value to humanitarian agencies more generally. About that first agenda, the system-related one, we should acknowledge that some evaluations and evaluative processes, so the interagency humanitarian evaluations, the peer reviews and so on, have addressed the question of system performance and collective performance quite directly and more or less successfully within their defined limits. I think there the problem has perhaps been more in a lack of consistency of actually conducting those exercises. But I think that's now changing, COVID permitting. And no doubt there's an important discussion to be had about how to strengthen those mechanisms and how to supplement them. But the thing I'd like to focus on more here, just for a minute, is the second agenda. So how about learning from evaluations across the sector? As I say, we didn't learn much from the State of the Humanitarian System exercise and from that evaluation sample about system or collective performance. We did learn quite a lot about a range of individual topics, but it was very piecemeal. It didn't really provide a basis for meta-analysis. And this problem of lack of intercomparability of data and evidence exists both within and between organizations, I think. So some agencies, like the World Food Programme, have put a lot of work into harmonizing evaluation practice within their organizations and in conducting meta-analysis of the results. So Andrea could tell us more about the WFP case, but I think such approaches do allow organizations to learn in a way that's really not possible with a less consistent approach to evaluation. Again, I should make one caveat there. I think sometimes evaluations just need to ask context-specific questions, as well as having more general utility, and we shouldn't lose that, but we can't completely standardize evaluations. But we perhaps need more commonality of approach. From a system-wide perspective, we've got a problem comparing across evaluations, and I'd like to just give one example before I finish. So about 5 years ago, ALNAP hosted an interagency initiative, an ISC initiative called the Syria Call, the Coordinated Accountability and Learning, Lesson Learning initiative. The original idea was that agencies working on the Syria crisis in the Syria region would use a common evaluative framework to enable a proper synthesis of results to be put together. But it proved impossible to agree that for reasons that John may be able to tell us about, and I can't quite remember myself. We couldn't agree it. Nor was there any full interagency evaluation of the Syria response to draw on. So as partial compensation for that, we did a thing called the Syria Synthesis and Gap Analysis, which pulled together findings from 20 separate evaluations and evaluative studies and identified gaps in the evaluation material. Though it wasn't a substitute for a system-wide evaluation, it was, I think, a useful exercise. But it certainly would have been stronger had the evaluation processes themselves been better harmonized. And we might want to discuss whether agreeing a common evaluative framework is a realizable ambition in any given context, or is it that very different organizational demands, very different evaluation timetables and so on, mean that that's actually just not practical. I've talked long enough. Let me summarize, if I may, Susanna. So I think lower evaluation quality means lower evidential value of findings, but we should be wary of overloading evaluations with unrealistic expectations about the strength of evidence they can produce. The second thing is current evaluation practice tends to produce very atomized evidence, and there's limited scope for extrapolating from single evaluations. There's no real substitute for interagency or system-wide evaluations on system issues, but we could learn a lot more if there was more consistent coverage of those criteria that are about how a given intervention sits within a broader set of interventions, about connectedness, about coherence, coordination, and so on. And there's not enough of that in existing evaluations. And finally, I think there is a great deal of value in being able to read across evaluations, to do comparative analysis. And I think that better harmonized approaches to evaluation, both internally and externally to organizations, could enable us to do that better. And I'll leave it there, Susanna, and hand back to you.
Great, thank you. So I think you mentioned so many issues that maybe the rest of our panelists are going to get into. You know, the quality issue, the issue of comparability, the issue of actually how do we take project level evaluations and try to pull them together, you know, looking at system-wide issues and all the challenges that we have in doing that. And so essentially, you know, what we hope our Eval Mapper tool is going to do is to at least show us what's out there. So there are a lot of evaluations out there, even if they're not addressing the system-wide issues. So in just a moment, we're actually going to launch our Eval Mapper tool, and then we'll come back to you, James, at the end to get your reflections on that. So let me first just say a few words about the EvalMapper tool that we're launching now. So essentially, EvalMapper is a map of evaluative evidence. What you'll see in a few minutes is a demo video, which will show you how this tool can actually help us visualize evaluations by region, but then going, laser focused into specific topics. So essentially, what this tool allows us to do is to visualize potential evidence gaps as well. So with that, I'm going to actually hand over to the LNAP team to launch the video, and then we'll go back to James at the end to see if he has any comments on it.
Welcome to this walkthrough for EvalMapper. EvalMapper is a tool designed to help identify evidence gaps and facilitate synthesis studies. It does so by enabling you to quickly visualize existing humanitarian evaluation evidence in LNAP's help library through geographical regions and a range of evaluation-specific filters. The first thing you'll see when you enter EvalMapper is a world map divided into regions. When hovering the mouse over a region, it will tell you how many evaluations are currently available in EvalMapper that pertain to that region. Above the map, we can apply filters to help narrow down the search. As you apply the filters, the results on the map update. The first filter here is the level of analysis, split into project, system-wide, country, response, and multi-country. You can also select evaluation types. These have been selected following consultations with evaluation experts by the LNAP Secretariat. You can also narrow down the search by year, and finally, you can decide whether to see the results by sectors or cross-cutting themes. The cross-cutting themes have also been identified in consultation with evaluation experts and the LNAP membership. You can see all the definitions we're using on the separate definitions page. Now, going back to the map, I'll select Southern Asia as my region. What you see after choosing a region is a table with the results split into each country in your chosen region across either themes or sectors. I didn't select any filters here when clicking on the region, but they remain available on the results page. And these results will also update as you apply the filters. Once you've decided on a category and country, you can click on the cell to see the results. Here I've chosen midterm and formative evaluations on forced displacement and migration in Bangladesh. Then you can click on an evaluation to see them in LNAP's help library. You can read more about EvalMapper on the About page and the FAQ section. LNAP is continuously updating EvalMapper with new evaluations, but this map is a project that we want to develop with all members to make sure that it suits the needs of everyone looking for humanitarian evaluation evidence. So if you can't find your evaluation in EvalMapper, then please use the submit button to share it. And if you have any other ideas or comments, then please do get in touch with us. Over time, the number of evaluations in EvalMapper will grow. Together, we can further build on the foundations we've laid for this useful research tool. You can find EvalMapper on lnap.org/EvalMapper.
Okay, great. Thank you. Fantastic. So I hope that all of you are as excited about this tool as I am. The potential to actually visually see the evidence base and then to see that organized in a way that helps us make sense of it. I think that's very exciting, and hopefully this will help all of us in our search to find evaluations faster and to use them for learning. So now we're going to dive back into our panel discussion and also get some initial reactions from our panelists on the EvalMapper tool. So James, I just want to go back to you for a second. I don't know if you can comment on how you found existing evaluation evidence in the past for some of the synthesis work, and how do you think this tool may be able to help you do that maybe in a different way or in a faster way? Do you have any comments on that?
Yes, and well, let me first say, I wish we'd had this tool 3 years ago when we did the evaluation synthesis, because it would have made our life an awful lot easier. This looks really good. I think that the main thing for me is that the more geographically specific you can be, and indeed the more thematically specific you can be in your search, the more likely it is you're going to find useful evidence, useful learning to apply. It's much more difficult when you're trying to extrapolate lessons across a very, very broad field. So I don't think we've had anything quite like this before. It's been a bit haphazard, the search process, in my experience anyway. Of course, it depends on people actually providing their evaluations to plug into the library. I mean, it always depends on that. But assuming that people do, and they do them in a way that's timely, and indeed they actually conduct the evaluations, I think this is a really potentially extremely useful tool. And so I really welcome it. I think it's great.
Okay, great, thank you. So it's interesting that you mentioned that kind of in the geographic focus and geographic area, because we are going to dive into that deeper through our panelists. So now we want to go and look more at the learning function from evaluations. So we're going to go to our next panelist to look at a good practice example from Norway and some of the work commissioned by their independent evaluation office. So I have the pleasure of introducing Annette Williamson. She's a senior advisor at the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation and their independent evaluation office. She previously worked for the World Food Program, and her research interests include humanitarian aid, conflicts, and peace building. Now, Norway has commissioned a range of evaluation synthesis studies and lesson learned reports. So Annette, can you tell us more about these and how you commission these studies and perhaps what you've learned in the process?
Yes, thank you, Susanna. And first, I would just like to say that I think this tool is extremely useful, and I wish that we had the same tool on our website, because sometimes, you know, we have new colleagues and we have to, those of us have been here more years, we have to kind of remember what happened in the previous evaluations, and it would be much easier if you had this kind of tool. So as Susanna said, I work in the independent evaluation department in the Norwegian Aid Administration. We are governed by a separate mandate to evaluate the implementation of the Norwegian development policy, and this also includes humanitarian support. So usually we conduct or commission about 10 evaluations per year, and these are mostly strategic or thematic evaluations, but some are also synthesis studies. And the nature of these synthesis studies are usually that they are done of areas, topics, or countries of priority for the Norwegian development aid or development policy engagement. So I would like to just talk a little bit about the purpose of these synthesis studies from our side, and I think that these are threefold. So the first one is that it is a way to make existing evaluation evidence accessible for decision makers and stakeholders. Because of the wealth of the evaluation evidence out there, I think that we have a role to facilitate learning from these evaluations. And I think that these syntheses may contribute to knowledge-based design of new programs, and they may also be useful for program people and decision makers in assessing how to adjust ongoing programs. For example, is there a need for adjustment changes? What does the evidence in this area say, and etc. Secondly, we do these synthesis studies to prepare for our own evaluations. So we try to identify where there is a need for more knowledge, where are the gaps, and where do we need more evaluation evidence. We also try to look at what are the possibilities to collect data. Are data accessible? Are there any particular data challenges, etc.? And a final purpose for us is to use these synthesis studies for triangulation in evaluations we are conducting of the Norwegian engagement. So one example is that during the last year, we have conducted evaluations of the total Norwegian aid engagement in South Sudan and in Somalia. And for these two countries, we have already done synthesis studies that we call country evaluation briefs. And the synthesis studies are very important for triangulating the findings in the evaluations themselves. Lastly, to reply to your question, we have a few lessons, and I think that they relate also to what James said in his comment. So firstly, the synthesis studies that we have conducted are of high interest. So I think that, yeah, there is a high demand. Secondly, and more on the synthesis studies themselves, we believe it's key to be transparent on the methodology of the study. And thirdly, it's important to be clear on the limitations. For example, the synthesis study will not be better than the evaluations feeding into it. So if you haven't asked good questions in the evaluations themselves, it's quite hard to respond to the questions that you want to respond to in the synthesis study. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Annette. I think it's really interesting because you did pick up on those points around quality and about how do you actually do a synthesis study and get it into the hands of decision makers in a usable format. So I wonder if you can just tell us maybe really briefly in a few words, how do these kind of country level synthesis studies feed into wider learning across the humanitarian and development and fragile space states, kind of the nexus, if you will?
Also, firstly, I know that I'm speaking to the choir here, but the use of evidence from research and evaluations and experience is extremely important for decision makers everywhere, right? So these kind of systematization of knowledge and analysis, and not only immediate results information, is necessary. In terms of wider learning, I think that the work on the synthesis studies may feed into this in several ways. So, and it's also related to why we are doing this in the first place, and it's just to make knowledge available to others. And I think since we come from very different evaluation units, when we evaluate, we look at one specific thing that may be very important to us, but by synthesizing everything, it may be more useful and it may have a wider use for everyone. And secondly, I think it's also important for coordination. And from our side, we have a long way to go when it comes to coordinate evaluation efforts. And I think the synthesis studies are like, it's a small step on the way to coordination. And when possible, it's important to build on what exists, and it may help not to overburden partners. And thirdly, I think as for us, we also use other agencies' synthesis studies when we design our own evaluations, and it's also important for triangulation, for evaluations everywhere, I believe. Thanks.
Okay, great, thank you. I should add that we have all of your evaluations now in our eval mapper, and we'll continue to add them to that. So hopefully you don't need to create your own website, and that's really kind of the idea here, is to have the global public good. So thank you, Annette, for your perspective. It was really interesting to have the donor perspective on this issue. So now we're going to turn to the UN perspective and go to Andrea Cook of WFP. So let me just say a few words about Andrea. So Andrea Cook is the Director of Evaluation at the World Food Programme. Previously, Andrea was the Director of Evaluation at the United Nations Population Fund. Prior to joining the United Nations, Andrea worked for over 20 years in international development, both in the UK and around the world. She works both in roles spanning policy, programming, and evaluation. Andrea is currently co-chair of Eval Partners and serves on a number of expert advisory groups for evaluation at the global level. Now moving to Andrea. So Andrea, you've supported collaborative and joined up approaches to evaluation, both in your role at WFP and in other evaluation fora. From WFP's perspective, why is having better system-wide sharing of evaluative evidence and learning important? And where do you see some of the main opportunities and challenges in order to achieve this better in practice?
Thanks. It's very good to be here with everyone today. And just to say, maybe speaking on the tool, in WFP, we make sure that all of our evaluation reports are uploaded on the ALNAP website. We've also been doing a lot around synthesis in recent years, and had started to think about setting up and experimenting with our own EvalMapper tool. When we discovered that ALNAP was going in this direction, we just put all of that on hold and said we will sort of contribute to the collective effort. Because in WFP, what we need is to be able to look at our own evidence, but in particular countries on particular thematic issues, we also need to take into account the wider evidence base. So this is just absolutely fantastic for us, and thank you. So coming to your points, Susanna, first of all, I'd just like to speak about collaboration and joint work as it relates to the WFP function, and then I'll talk a little bit more broadly. So our evaluation policy sets out a vision for WFP that by 2021, evaluative thinking, behaviour and systems is embedded in our culture of accountability and learning and contributing to ending global hunger. A key part of this is making sure that we deliver the right evidence to the right people at the right time, and ensuring that evaluation results are reflected and integrated into the policies, strategies and programmes. What this has led to in practice is to a significant scale up of the function, both in terms of the geographic and the thematic coverage, particularly at the country level. And working out what and how to evaluate, we take into account strategic relevance, evidence gaps, timeliness for decision making, risks, feasibility, proportionality and complexity. And all of that then gets sort of fed into the type of evaluation, the timing, the approach and the methods that we use. We carry out three main types of evaluation. So the centralized evaluations carried out by the Office of Evaluation. Decentralized evaluations are carried out by units in WFP outside of our office. And we also carry out increasing the impact evaluation through a hybrid approach, where the Office of Evaluation works in partnership with country officers to deliver impact evaluations that contribute to building a more solid evidence base in specific known evidence gaps, such as the interaction between cash-based transfers and gender equality, for example, or climate change and resilience, where we're trying to build a body of high quality evidence. Since 2016, we've been developing capacities at the regional level, developing our impact evaluation approaches. And as we've been increasing now the body of evidence, we really are having to work much harder to make sure that the evidence that's been generated is applying learning from one area across others. And increasingly we're using synthesis to do that, evidence summaries and other types of approaches. Turning to our partnership work, the external landscape has evolved considerably. So a key driver of this is the Agenda 2030 and the commitment to work more closely with nationally led development and humanitarian response. In WFP and beyond the Office of Evaluation, we're doing more in using and curating evidence for this. So in WFP, over the last 5 years or so, all WFP country officers have been working with national governments and partners to carry out national zero hunger reviews to identify priorities in ending hunger in those countries. And that's then being a key driver of our own programs and activities. We're also doing much more in terms of joint evaluation at global and country level, and building partnerships, not just to deliver, but also to use evaluation and developing capacity at the national level. So a key interesting element in our work in recent years has been the joint evaluations that we've been doing with governments of their own policies and programs, or where we have joint initiatives. So we've done interesting work in Benin, Eswatini, India, Namibia, Kenya, Peru, and Djibouti, just to name a number of countries in the past few years. And that's been really transformative for us in the way we think about generation of evaluation, how we deliver that, and how we then curate the evidence and make sure it's going in the right direction, which is nationally led priorities. We're very active within UNEG in these partnerships, so the UN Evaluation Group, and working on a whole range of issues relating to strengthening decentralized evaluation capacity, building greater commitment to evidence and utility use, and sort of very active there. We're also involved in communities of practice, including EvalNap, including Eval partners in ALNAP. That would be an interesting one. We've also, in the area of food security and agriculture and rural development, worked with the Rome-based agency organizations, and we launched a community of practice called Eval Forward. So they're all trying to work, I think, at this kind of intersection between the generation of evidence, the building of capacities, and the interpretation of that evidence. And we also, in the impact evaluation field, work with the World Bank in this area. And we also, importantly, in the humanitarian space, work with the IASD mechanism, so the Interagency Humanitarian Evaluation Steering Group. James was referring a little bit to some of this work before, but just in the last year, we've completed evaluations on the drought response in Ethiopia, to Cyclone Idai in Mozambique, and we're working on the first thematic evaluation there, which is looking at responding to gender in emergencies. In terms of opportunities and challenges, I think within the UN system, attention to system-wide evaluation is going to be very important for us within the system to be able to develop more synthesis, joint and interagency evaluation. But that's kind of within the UN system. I think the COVID-19 pandemic is driving change, and particularly in the area of rapid evidence assessment and system-wide sharing of learning. So there's quite a lot of activity there, particularly under the COVID-19 Evaluation Coalition, to generate lesson learned studies, but also to plan and coordinate evaluation activity, which we very much welcome at WFP. System-wide evaluation, for us, it facilitates this identification of the local and the global lessons, builds away from just the instrumental value of that particular evaluation at that particular time and place with those particular partners, and allows us to sort of inform joint learning and driving change and improvement across the system. So, I mean, we really look to be working with EvalMapper and other partners within EvalNap to make better use, and looking forward to the next State of Humanitarian System report, because hopefully we'll have worked around some of those problems that James has just highlighted. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. I think you gave us a great overview of how WFP is working on this issue and how you set a strategic evaluation agenda. It's really interesting because I think the key point is how do we actually join up all of these different initiatives, and how can ELNAP actually use its convening power to do that? I know, you mentioned the COVID-19 coalition, which I know Norway is a part of as well. And so I think it's interesting, to see how these initiatives are being taken forward and how we can do that better. I just want to ask you one quick follow-up question, Andrea. So if your WFP recently won the Nobel Prize and you're fairly well resourced, what would be your one piece of advice actually for a small evaluation department, maybe in an NGO, in terms of deciding how do they actually set their strategic agenda and look at evidence gaps if you don't have the same resources that someone like WFP would have?
I think, it's important for those in evaluation functions, large or small, to be really thinking about how you tailor the function to meet the particular needs of your organization. In WFP, we very actively try to span accountability and learning needs, working closely with partners. So a number of our evaluations are coverage-based. So we're expected by our management and our board to evaluate all of our country strategic plans in WFP, all our policies. That's a very high level of coverage. But in other areas, on our decentralized evaluations, our impact evaluations, our strategic evaluations, and indeed our own synthesis evaluations, there we work very closely in a very consultative way with management to identify what should be those priorities, and then sort of make the case for the funding and the appropriate approach. So I think it is important for evaluation management to work very closely with management of whatever organization we're in to clarify the needs and work out then sort of what the menu of different types of evaluative work should do. I could maybe I'm not sure whether it's worthwhile giving an indication as well of WFP. We're a voluntarily funded organization. it's a very high level and unfortunately increasing level of funding. WFP is the first organization I've worked in where the increase in funding coming to us is not seen as a good sign. It's a sign that the world is in crisis. So we've got a commitment actually of 0.8% of our contributions income in the organization is to be spent on evaluation. Since 2016, we've more than tripled the actual dollar amount that we're spending on evaluation in the organization. And the percentage has gone from 0.15% of total contributions in 2016 up to 0.30% of total contributions income in 2019. So we're seeing a growth and improvement there. But because we're voluntarily funded and much of the evaluation activity is funded from programmatic resources, one of the things I think that we've done that's quite interesting is put in place a financing mechanism called a contingency evaluation fund that allows us to complement the resources at the country office level, particularly for smaller country programs, or where people want to do something really interesting evaluatively, but they maybe don't have the full level of resources. So we set up a contingency evaluation fund with a transparent criteria and decision-making process to enable us at the centre to top up and provide incentive-based funding for country officers to be able to do a bit more. And I think that's quite an interesting concept that can be applied in many different organisations. We've also tried to support setting up a help desk, providing advisory services. Particularly, we've developed our regional bureau capacity to be able to be advising, particularly our country officers, to make the best use of the resources. So I think it's both advocating for more, making sure it's aligned with organisational needs, but also putting in place the support mechanisms to really make the best use of that scarce funding.
Great, thank you. I'm sure you've given a lot of ideas to those in our audience about how they can argue for more resources and the strategic importance of evaluations going forward. I also just want to thank you as WFP because we worked in close collaboration in terms of working together to develop the EvalMapper tool. So thank you once again for that collaboration. So now we're going to just go to our final speaker. And before that, I want to remind the audience to please put your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So specifically now we're going to go and look at the MENA region and how we can support system-wide learning at the regional level. Our next speaker is Ziad Musa. So he is a development professional with a passion for evaluation. Over the past 20 years, he has managed complex evaluations across the Arab world and in the global South in well over 40 countries, and including for almost all major donors. He was the driving force behind the establishment of the Middle East and North Africa Evaluation Association in 2011. He also previously served as the president of the International Organization of Cooperation in Evaluation. So Ziad, as an experienced evaluation practitioner in the MENA region, can you speak briefly about the evaluative work that you are doing now, looking at learning both across the humanitarian sector and within the wider ecosystem of actors in the region? What are some of the gaps that you're seeing related to system-wide learning? Yeah.
Thank you, and welcome to the MENA region. Actually, this region is more or less the biggest humanitarian hub for now. If you mention Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, Iraq, Libya, and counting. So indeed, it's quite timely to reflect from a practitioner perspective on what is going on and what are some of the challenges for system-wide learning. Personally, I work mostly on quality assurance of, let's say, M&E systems and processes in large organizations, and I happen to do some of the evaluations at multi-country level or cross-sectoral but also smaller ones at the country level and the country sector. If we look at the ecosystem, I think this is key, because we cannot look at evaluation as a standalone discipline or something that comes in as a parachute. I think this is a long gone era. The ecosystem in the MENA region is quite complex. I must also say that it's quite fragmented, a huge turnover, particularly in terms of the agencies doing humanitarian work. Also, quite a lot of actors with sometimes competing priorities. You have the UN organizations, you have the bilaterals, you have the multilaterals, you have the academia, you have the practitioners, the consulting companies, the umbrella networks, etc. And from what I see over and over and over is that we need to step up in terms of the understanding of some of the basic constituents of that ecosystem. If I mention, let's say, gender, and how do you contextualize the gender approach? I mean, that one might be quite obvious, but add to it, I don't know, disability, conflict sensitivity, accountability to affected population. In all of these topics, you see a lot of good practices emerging, but you miss that overarching, let's say, framework or approach or joint willingness to tackle these in a way that makes sense and that advances, I would say, the well-being. Another salient remark is the monitoring overkill. We see in the titles a lot of meal and mel and what have you, but the victims here are the E and the L, the evaluation and the learning. There is a tendency for monitoring overkill, and we often lose on the unique opportunity of embedding real-time what comes in from monitoring, particularly in fast-paced, protracted crisis where the geopolitical context changes, where a region can be accessible today, would be a hard-to-reach area tomorrow, etc. So in terms of capitalizing on the learning, but also providing an evaluative dimension to kind of see what works and what does not work. And a third remark, if I may put on the debate, and I'm not going to take long, it would be interesting in the Q&A session to kind of deepen up the reflection, is the use of evaluation. Our discipline is somehow underutilized. When you spend 3 and 4 and 5 months bickering with the agency on the commas and the sentences and the findings of an evaluation, let alone when the management response comes in, let alone how the management response is put into practice. And the big question is whether the broader audience is aware of what is going on and where this is leading. This is quite essential. I think the common thread that joins all of these is, you mentioned at the beginning the passion. Well, my passion is for national evaluation capacity. Ever since I stepped into the profession, and I've been dreaming of seeing the evaluation becoming more indigenous, I would say, and having the right intended users using this evaluation, not just for accountability to donors and not just for a feel good that we did a good job, but also to advance things. Crises do have a root cause, and conflicts often are a way of shaking things, possibly to move these root causes in the right dimension. If I might look at the context of Beirut and Lebanon, I mean, ultimately, either we stay in the same status quo that has been killing us for the last 40 years, or really things have to change and go on a different path. And evaluation of humanitarian work, but also development work at large, is an immense empowerment tool and a very important tool to push things into that order.
Great, thank you so much. I think it's really interesting, you know, that you're kind of pushing us in that direction of saying, you know, it's not enough to spend 4 or 5 months working on an evaluation, but we really need to look at how we're using that information. And then looking at learning really at the local level, I suppose, is what this really comes down to ultimately. So it's not about having an evaluation report and giving it for the upward accountability function, but it's about how do we have the conversations that need to come out of those evaluations actually at the end, and how can we engage all of the stakeholders in those conversations better. So Zed, I just want to go back to you then really quickly. If you could just give like 1 or 2 really specific concrete suggestions for our audience today, maybe drawing from your previous work with Eval Partners and IOCE, what do we need to get better at learning? You know, you mentioned maybe we need to focus more on the E and move away from, you know, combining that with the meal function and understanding, you know, what is distinctive about evaluation itself. But what 1 or 2 concrete suggestions would you give us today if we really do want to look at this learning and at the national level?
Okay, the first suggestion that really jumps into my face is that interest functions within the MEL, what have you construct to locals beyond the national project officer or an MIS specialist or what have you. I mean, transferring that global knowledge into a local level, and this is what the entire Eval constellation, whether it's the IOCE, whether it's Eval Partners, whether it's Eval Forward, Eval Youth, Eval Gender Plus, etc. The whole system that we've been patiently building, and that has, again, as a common thread, a global evaluation agenda 2020 that was supposed to be revisited this year, and then some issues brought forward for 2025. That famous agenda says that there is still a lot of unrealized potential for evaluation that needs to come together, and this should be nationally owned and nationally driven. So building local capacity in that sense is an absolute necessity. The other one is what ALNAP is trying to do, is to kind of put these different approaches and stakeholders with very good intentions, but with diverging institutional, political, what have you, perspectives into to sit on the table and reflect collectively on how to tackle these challenges, and not keep reflecting and reflecting, but I mean reflect, come up with something, adopt it, and move forward.
Okay, great, thank you. So I think that all of you have given us a lot of food for thought. We're a little bit ahead of time actually, but we're going to move directly into the audience Q&A. So I'm getting questions coming in. So I'm going to look at the questions here, and then let's try to have a conversation, and then you can reply to one another and also reply to the questions that we've had. So we have quite a few questions, it seems, that are coming in, you know, somewhat related to COVID-19 and the effect of the sector, both at a higher level, but then also how is COVID-19 affecting maybe the quality and the quantity of evaluations being conducted? It seems like COVID is the issue that everyone has on the top of their mind, as John Mitchell framed it. So let me just maybe go briefly to Annette and maybe Andrea, if you want to weigh in on the COVID issue. I know that you're both working on this from some angles. So if you just want to say a few words about that, that seems to be what's on the forefront of everyone's minds at the moment. So let me hand over maybe to Annette Williamson first.
Yes, thanks. No, so this was something that we started discussing, of course, immediately when COVID happened, because we were not allowed to travel anywhere. And then how would we actually do the evaluations? And I think that synthesis studies is actually something that you can do now. So that is one thing. But what we did is that we through EvalNet, which is the evaluation network in the OECD DAC. They took the initiative to create this global COVID-19 Global Evaluation Coalition. I always get the order of the words wrong, but that was an effort to try to coordinate better the evaluation we are doing. So to begin with, on initiative from Canada, they started producing these lessons learned notes. So they collected evidence from evaluations by the members of this network and made short communication products for decision makers on different topics. So there's one on food security, one on gender education, there's one on cash transfers coming soon. So that's something we have been doing, but we are of course all the time discussing how we will actually plan our evaluations more like COVID sensitive, because I think we also have a responsibility to, we can't really gather a lot of people either. So we have to all the time think what is the most sensitive way of conducting the evaluations now.
Andrea, did you want to weigh in maybe with just a few points on that? And then we'll go to another question.
Yeah, so like Annette, we've sort of been making this effort to contribute to the lessons learning. So we contributed quite a lot of evidence to the study on a paper on food security, on cash-based transfers, on education and gender, for example. And we see that's been really valuable in really being able to pull out key lessons and apply those. We also had done within WFP an evaluation of the Ebola response in West Africa. So we produced an internal learning to pull out the key lessons from that regional response in West Africa and apply that and share that in the organization at the early days of the pandemic. In terms of the question about the impact on our ongoing studies, I mean, we've had to work very hard to be very engaged and very, very sensitive with our country office management. But I'd say pretty much for all of our OEV country level evaluations, we do a lot of them. We were doing over 10 of those this year. And a couple of them were cancelled because it was felt it was not feasible to do any meaningful evaluation work in particularly challenging contexts. But all the rest of them have gone ahead. And we've basically worked in different ways. So we have not been flying people around. I think it's a really welcome opportunity to take stock and look at the carbon footprint amongst other things for our evaluation work as well. So we've been working, all of our evaluation teams have a combination of national and international teams. But what we've been doing is working out how to make better use of the data that's available. So it's been a welcome opportunity to dig in rather than be relying on what's coming out of interviews and things. To find smart ways of doing those interviews. Now, in some cases, that's using and working with our national evaluators. In other cases, it's using smart technologies like this and being able to use that appropriately. But we're it's taking a bit more time to do that. And it requires more careful outreach and probably more respectful outreach with certain types of key stakeholders. But we're finding a way. For WFP, because so many of our evaluations are of humanitarian response, a key challenge is how we bring a beneficiary perspective and voice into the evaluations. So again, we're sort of taking our time in the inception phases of these studies to work out how best to do that. Now, we can do that in certain countries easier than others. A country like Zimbabwe with a high level of mobile phone connectivity is a very different context to some of the other countries where we're trying to do this. But we also, because WFP has really also stepped up on its remote assessment and vulnerability assessment and monitoring tools, we're able to sort of piggyback in a light way onto some of that. So we're finding we're able to carry on, but adapting as we go. As we go forwards, we're then sort of looking for our new evaluations that are starting, or evaluations that have been in the field, is how we make them kind of COVID sensitive. And we're also looking at how we evaluate the overall COVID response for WFP, and starting that quite now, because we don't want to leave it too late. We want to be learning the lessons now, so that they're feeding into management decisions on how they go forwards, because this is going to affect the way we're operating as an organization, the partnerships we're in for the next few years. So we don't want to leave it too long, but we're looking at different ways of delivering that kind of global level COVID response evaluation than our usual approaches to complex emergency evaluations or strategic evaluations. So it's been a really great opportunity to rethink how we do quite a lot of our work, but we're finding the commitment to it is still there. I had one case where I said to a country office, we can't do this evaluation, it's just not possible. And they turned around and said, but you must do this, we need this now. And that is a wonderful message to be hearing, I should say.
Great. No, it's fantastic. So, we talk a lot about adaptive management, but it sounds like we also need to be adaptive as evaluators and as an evaluation community. And I guess, the model that we've been using for evaluation is actually changing as a result of COVID. We've talked a lot about national evaluation capacity. I think remote M&E, this isn't a new theme, but it's being prominent again. So I want to go now to a question, maybe to tie this back to kind of the national evaluation capacity. And so Zaid, you mentioned, the Indigenous evaluation capacity. So I want to turn a question to you actually that we have coming in saying, what are some of the concrete steps that we could take to build an Indigenous evaluation capacity, given this issue and it's receiving even more prominence because of COVID? Could you speak about what are the concrete steps then that all of us as evaluators and organizations could take to support this better?
Okay, but let me jump a bit before to that COVID, and to excuse my language, to de-dramatize a bit. I mean, if we have colleagues from the Red Cross, Red Crescent in the audience, there has always been within the humanitarian sphere hard to reach areas, COVID or not. And COVID, hopefully, if the rumors and the news and the announcements come together, we should get to a vaccine quite soon. But I wish we can vaccinate humanity against war, because these are situations that will get repeated and repeated and repeated. So anyone who has been working in a hard-to-reach area, suddenly, because of COVID, the entire planet became a hard-to-reach area for a while, and then it will get better. So we have in our toolbox and in our practices and in the way we have been approaching evaluation some kind of some tools and approaches that gained more prominence now because of COVID, and which in a sense have democratized learning. Suddenly, as Andrea was saying, we're taking time to breathe, look back, take stock, build capacity remotely, and when we're in front of screens all across the world, obviously the carbon footprint is lower, but also it's quite democratic. You need a decent internet connection and a computer, and there you are learning about what happens, versus taking vacation and running through visa hassles and finding funding and traveling back and forth and taking off from work, and the rest is history. With this said, when we mention about making evaluation indigenous, it is doing a bit, again, what Andrea, but also Annette hinted at, investing in local capacity. This is ultimately the human and scientific and the eval capital that would remain when the crisis resolves, or when the world would move from MENA now to Armenia and Azerbaijan, and after that, God knows where. So as the priorities move along, investing in local capacity is something very essential. Now, very concretely, there are the regional evaluation associations like Evalmena, and there are country evaluation associations. Yemen has one, Iraq is on its way to have one, and Syria there's a group, Egypt, Lebanon, etc. These are one-stop shops, listservs, time for a roof and a place where evaluators can meet and discuss. So this is one very concrete step. The other step is, working beyond individual capacity. And here I just love the simple model that Eval Partners follows. So Eval Partner, the model of Eval Partners works on individual capacity, on institutional capacity, on the enabling environment around these two aspects, and on the interaction between all of them. And hence, again, investing too much in individuals but without challenging the enabling environment would be counterproductive. And the same would go for the institutions who are supposed to become the main drivers of that evaluation. Over.
Sure. So I guess there's a role both for institutions and evaluators to be driving this change. And we're already doing it, I guess, by thinking about how we listen, to populations affected. And so we just need to take that maybe a step further. So we have another question coming in. I think I'm going to direct this one to James Darcy. So the question is, what sort of balance do we need in terms of having both evaluations which inform projects in real time, as well as synthesis style evaluations which inform the system? And then how best to prioritize the resource allocation. So this goes, I think, the real-time kind of evaluation work, we can maybe separate that from monitoring. And then how should we do that, in terms of the resources and where we're putting them? So I'm going to give that question first to James. And the question actually came from Cheyenne, who is a teacher at the DME at the Fletcher School. So James, do you want to talk a little bit about how we find that balance actually between real-time evaluation and then synthesis studies, and how do we prioritize the resources?
Yeah, and that question caught my eye from our colleague at the Fletcher School. This question about balancing the demand for evidence up and evidence down, and I think this is so important. There is real value in being able to take evidence up to a certain level to inform policy. And I've worked with UNICEF and others to try and do exactly that. Andrea has described how they do it in WFP. So we shouldn't minimize that. But the real evidential questions, I think, are at a local level, at a lower level than that. Some of those are evaluation questions. Some of them do relate to monitoring. I mean, I find it amazing that the monitoring function seems so divorced from evaluation. The monitoring stuff seems to generate a whole lot of data that kind of is used for accountability purposes and feeds into reports that some people read and so on. It's not often, in my experience, used for program adaptation. And I think we need to, I would argue that we're asking essentially the same questions in the evaluation process and in the monitoring process, or we should be. Are we doing the right thing? Are we still doing the right thing? How well are we doing it? Somebody mentioned the CHS standard in the Q&A. How well are we doing this? Not just are we delivering the outputs? Is it working? And is it working for people? And how do we know? So in other words, this question about systems that enable reflective practice at the local level with communities, but also with other agencies and with government, is so weak. We treat monitoring I think, as a kind of vehicle for generating a rather loose form of accountability. So I think we've got the balance a bit wrong, personally. And that's not to argue at all against what we've been saying about the need for greater comparability between evaluations and being able to do synthesis. I think it's terribly important. I mentioned that I think we're rather weak in evaluating effectiveness. And I really think we are. And it's partly because our means of evaluating effectiveness are so circular and internal. We evaluate programs often just on the basis of their own logic. And we have very little input of external evidence and data. So when I'm asked to evaluate the effectiveness of a program, I'm pretty much dependent on what's already been generated the evidence that's already there. And I would tend to turn the question back to people and say, well, how do you know if it's being effective? Is it actually working in the real world? Not did you deliver the outputs? Is it working? How do you know? What are your systems for knowing that? And how are you using that information then to be genuinely adaptive to changes in context? So I think we've got the balance wrong a bit. And I think we've misunderstood a little the relationship between monitoring and evaluation. And I think we need to take a hard look at that.
Okay, great. So we have another question that was submitted, which is how do we actually elevate local perspectives? And so I think that we got into this. And at the same time, some of these issues that are coming up are saying, also how do we interact with decision makers and getting them the information? So there's kind of a tension here. So on the one hand, as evaluators, we need to be reactive to decision makers and understand what their needs are. And at the other time, we need to have those same conversations with local people and with the beneficiaries or affected populations, whatever the term is that you want to use. So who are we actually being mediators in this process, and how do we play that role? And is that asking too much of evaluators? So I want to kind of group those questions together, maybe. I don't know who I should direct this question to. Does anyone want to offer on the panel to take a stab at it? I see Ziad there, so why don't you come in here on how we kind of play this mediator role in the space?
Yeah, interesting. I can answer as a previous eval partner chair, and then maybe Andrea can complement as the current eval partner co-chair. So one of the very interesting constructs that we did was the Global Parliamentarian Forum for Evaluation, where we as evaluators interacted closely with parliamentarians around the world. And the parliamentarian said, when you come to me with a 160-page report, my attention span is just 5 minutes. You need to catch it. You need to give me what I need to tell my constituency, or what I need to ask from the government, or what I need to relay to those in charge of a specific policy. And hence, you have literally to change the way you present your reports into a two-pager thing that goes straight into the subject. So that is a very concrete example. Within the work of eval partners now, there is a flagship program that intends to reach out to non-traditional evaluation actors. So preaching the converters, those who are absolutely beyond this magnificent audience who's still with us until now, who might have heard about evaluation and who would be interested in learning more. And that COVID brought evaluation into the debate somehow unintentionally. Suddenly we start questioning, how do we license a medication, and what are randomized control trials, which was our favorite topic in the evaluation community back in 2008 to 2009. Suddenly we're questioning, what is the relevance of the data? Do we judge the situation by the number of infected, or those who are dead, or by the ratio of death to the total population, et cetera, et cetera? So it's a really golden opportunity to take that wagon and put evaluation more prominently on the scene. I'll stop.
Andrea, do you want to say a few words maybe about this tension between reaching out and needing to be this kind of information mediator between all of these different constituencies and groups, and how you think that we can do that more concretely in a more ethical and mindful way?
As I said, in WFP, we're sort of trying to work more at some of these communities where, there's an intersection between policymakers, evaluators, programming, decision makers. So Eval Forward is a very good example here as well of how we're trying to do this. Quite often, evaluators, we're sort of talking to ourselves. We concentrate a lot on what we're producing, but where does that go? We have to, as Annette was saying earlier, we have to look beyond that report and find ways to dynamically reutilize or repackage that learning, connect it to the decisions that are being made at the time. And that requires being in those spaces, being mindful, as Ziad said, of what people need and when they want it, but also putting effort into new ways of packaging. So in WFP, we've been working on a communications and knowledge management strategy, and a key element of that has been looking at how we disseminate evaluation products on multiple platforms in using different ways, as people were mentioning, you know, kind of infographics and video, using social media, other ways of sharing digital content, putting things into tools like evidence, the Eval Mapper, and sort of getting that information sort of out there and pushing it. So there's a lot of more need to sort of push the learning and direct it to the right places at the right time. And I think, you know, kind of new technologies, and again, I'd say with coming back to COVID, this has also given us an access to different spaces. You know, if you thought about flying people around to seminars and conferences, there's only so much that you're going to get out of that. As Ziad said, you know, this is sort of democratizing some of the place. So it's certainly been a lot easier for me to be involved in things that I wouldn't necessarily be flying around the world for, but to be engaging in these different spaces with decision makers. So I think finding ways to do that is better. Again, I keep coming back, you know, within the humanitarian community, the accountability to affected populations element of it is really, really important. And I don't feel we've got that right yet. How to go back and connect this learning at that level remains, it's not that I don't think people are trying, but I think I remain to be convinced that actually what we're doing is really the best way to do things. So I'd maybe put that for a question. It'd be interesting to know what people make of that side of it.
Great. No, there's so many issues, I think, to unpack there around how do we take something so it's not just a report, but then it's some kind of living knowledge that is actually shared in a more social function. I want to maybe go now to Annette, actually, you know, because you talked a lot about the studies commissioned by Norway. And so I suppose that, you know, one of the audience for that is high-level decision makers. And could you maybe say a couple words about, you know, when you're doing the synthesis study, does it have a greater impact on actually changing Norwegian policy? Have you seen that? And are there ways that you're monitoring the uptake? And does that determine what you do next, actually? Are you seeing it taking more of an advocacy role? Or, you know, what do you actually do then to make sure that the evaluation is acted upon?
Yes, it's a big question. I just wanted to comment quickly on this this tension between the decision, providing information for decision makers, because usually we evaluate the aid administration and Norway is not implementing anything directly, right? So what we have found in some evaluations that there are a lot of reporting requirements, but the question is reporting for who? Because what we found in our evaluations is that the Norwegian Aid Administration is asking the partners to collect all this information that is neither relevant for the partners nor for the policymakers in Norway. So we are trying to pose the question like, when do you need to make a decision, and what kind of evidence do you need to make that decision, and try to force that kind of thinking into our system. So I'm very interested in this topic, so I just wanted to comment on that. And with regard to the follow-up on the synthesis studies, so we don't have management response process for this synthesis studies, because it's a wider use, right? It's not evaluations of the areas that Norway are engaged in, but what we are usually doing is that we try to organize seminars, we try to facilitate platforms where these issues can be discussed, and then we hope that it's picked up. And I think, yeah, this webinar it's a good example of, yeah, this kind of networks. But we try to identify topics that engage people and that are important for the support that Norway does, and then try to feed into it like that. So what we have done so far is that we have done a series of country evaluation briefs of all the priority countries of Norway. It's 16 so far, I think, but we have also done thematic ones like how to work in long-term humanitarian crisis, and we have also supported other studies such as one on findings on SDG 4.5 on equality in education that was led by UNESCO. And then we also organized the seminar together with the education people here in NORAD, and yeah, tried to facilitate this. But I don't know if that was a good response to your question, but
Great. No, I think that's fantastic. And we have one final question from Vivian Walden of the British Red Cross, which is, how can we in Europe find the networks of local consultants for evaluations? And I'm not going to actually pose that to our panel because I think we've been hearing a lot about that. But I do just want to start to wrap it up now, actually, because we are coming to time. So I think all of our panelists, you've given us so much food for thought. We've heard about some of the synthesis studies done kind of at the country level. We've heard about the regional evaluation work. We've heard about evaluation capacity building, Indigenous evaluation. And you've also heard about our Eval Mapper tool, which I think is really exciting. It's because there's so many initiatives and so much evidence out there that we decided that we needed to launch this Eval Mapper. We really wanted to go to some of those issues that James was raising kind of early on, in that we know that there's so many project level evaluations, but how can we actually regroup them in a way that we can learn from them? And then how do we socialize that learning across our networks? So essentially going forward, we'd like you to look at our Eval Mapper tool, but we also need your help. We need to continue building upon the tool. And this was mentioned before. The building blocks are there, but we rely on you to submit your evaluations to us. So please do submit your evaluations. If you have any feedback on the tool, we'll be happy to receive that going forward. And then finally, I know that there was a lot of questions from the audience that we didn't get to today, but we do want to have follow-up conversations going forward on this. And with that, we have also my new colleague, Samir, who has joined us in the M&E team at ALNAP, and he's leading on ALNAP's community of practice. So the community of practice then is something that we're working to revitalize as part of our network to help continue this dialogue. And we want to answer some of your questions that we haven't answered today there. So I'm going to hand over to Samir just to say 1 or 2 minutes about his work on the community of practice. Samir, the floor is yours.
Hi everyone, I hope you could hear me. But yes, like Susanna said, my name is Samir Hafiz, and I joined ALNAP alongside Susanna to work on research in relation to evaluation, accountability and learning. As part of my role, I facilitate ALNAP's humanitarian monitoring and evaluation committee of practice. And to that end, I've already enjoyed speaking with some of you to hear about what you're working on and getting your feedback on how we can strengthen the community of practice going forward. So our monitoring and evaluation community of practice is a community group or humanitarian M&E practitioners, or those with a keen interest in this area, to share learning and examples of good practice, to raise questions and reach out for support, or to network and to collaborate, all with the purpose of improving humanitarian M&E. So if you haven't signed up already, I would encourage you to join us by following the link that I think has come up on the screen or will come up on the next slide. We will be taking forward any questions that we haven't had time to answer over into our online platform to continue the conversation together there. Going forward, we will have more regular M&E events like this webinar and member-led content for our community of practice. We will also be moving over our community of practice to a very lively new platform in the near future, so plenty for you to look forward to. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me at any time. I'll hand over to Susanna now to wrap up.
Okay, great, thank you. So we've touched on so many issues, kind of from the quality issue to the use issue to how do we commission and have a strategic evaluation agenda. This is just really the start of the conversation today. I think that we're going to have more events and more work going forward. And we, like Samir said, we really want to continue this dialogue with you. So it's a very exciting time at ALNAP. We have a bunch of new staff members. Samir is one of them. And I also want to wrap up also by thanking our communications team, who's done an amazing job actually working in the consultation process to put the Eval Mapper together and behind the scenes for this webinar today. So I really hope that you can join us. Sign up if you're not already signed up for our newsletter. Follow us on social media if you're not already. And most importantly, we hope that you can check out our Eval Mapper and engage with us going forward in the M&E community of practice. And with that, I'm going to close the webinar. So thank you very much. And thank you once again to all of our panelists for joining us and launching this discussion that we need to continue going forward. Thank you.